The Range Rover is as synonymous with the luxury 4x4 class as grass is synonymous with the color green. The Range Rover, after all, is the original luxury 4x4, and it started off the segment in 1970, but it would take many, many years before it would get any real competitors, meaning Mercedes ML Class, the Lexus LX, and the BMW X5. But none of them were as synonymous, like I said, with the luxury 4x4 theme as the original, the Range Rover. And one thing that is as synonymous as grass being green is the Range Rover's tendency to be quite unreliable, and this generation was no exception. This Range Rover that I'm standing right next to comes from the very last year of the P38 generation, which started out in 1994 and ended in 2002, right as the Rover group was being sold off by BMW because they weren't profitable. So this Range Rover was out while Rover was still a car brand and while they were owned by BMW, but it went away right as BMW technology actually started coming into the Range Rover full force. Overall, the whole story is quite complicated. So let's just take a step back and admire the P38 Range Rover in all of its glory and presence. This is one of the most beautiful SUVs that has ever been put out, especially on this later version of the P38 that dropped the plastic bumpers at each corner in favor of body colored bumpers. And this Range Rover is also the Westminster edition, and it's coming in all black, which we'll explain a little bit later on in the video. And if you're a longtime viewer of the Topher Parker Cars channel, you might recognize this Range Rover. It actually belongs to my dad, and we've done a couple videos on it as well. We did a video comparing it to other 1990s and early 2000s Land Rovers of the day, and we also did a St. George road trip where we took it on some light off-road trails. And if you've watched those videos, you will know that despite its appearance, this Range Rover has clocked 212,000 miles. So take that, Toyota Land Cruiser fanboys who think that their cars are the only ones that will last over 100,000 miles without an engine rebuild. Well, everybody, pick your jaws up off the ground because this Range Rover has had a recent engine rebuild. It made it all the way to about 207,000 miles before the engine finally blew its head gaskets and had some other issues at the same time. So my dad, instead of getting rid of this car, he decided to do a full engine rebuild because it had done 100,000 miles and over 10 years of reliable service for him. So he thought it was worth keeping it going. And I thought today we could do a full review type tour of the P38 Range Rover because we haven't actually done that yet. So with that, let's continue on. This car is a Westminster edition, as I've said, which means it comes fully equipped with things like an upgraded sound system and a navigation system inside there, which we'll look at in just a minute. It's hilarious and ridiculous. And it came in a couple special colors. This color is Java Black, and it was painted all over the body, meaning no plastic bumpers. Everywhere you look, it was just absolutely beautiful and looked extremely expensive. And it is exceedingly rare. I don't think I've ever seen another P38 Westminster ever. And we're standing in front of a very nice condition one with a ton of miles. Like I said, you wouldn't expect just looking at this Range Rover that it's had 212,000 miles put on it, but that's a testament to taking good care of your cars. So let's go on and talk about practicality. Around the back, what can you expect to see from any generation Range Rover? Of course, if you know your Range Rovers, a long-standing tradition of the Range Rover around the back is a split folding tailgate, and that is exactly the same with the P38. You have a button right here to release the hatchback, and then press that same button again, and you can fold down the actual tailgate, and then you just put this random plastic piece down, and what you have is a very comfortable bench to sit on, as I've made this joke several times already, as you wait for the tow truck to pick you up from the side of the road, because it's a Range Rover, so it'll break down at some point. Let's continue on and talk about practicality. You look inside and you find, as you'd expect for an SUV of this size, a large cargo area with a massive wide opening. It's very tall, it's quite deep, it's perfectly usable for a family of 5 for a weekend away. Just make sure you keep room for your tools and spare parts. That's another joke I've milked until it's dead. On the passenger side right here, you can find a little DVD disc slot, and that is for the GPS navigation system that came standard as part of the Westminster package. You would put a DVD in this slot right here that had a stored map on it for whatever area you were in, as long as all of the buildings and all the streets were exactly the same as they were 25 years ago. You should be fine with actually navigating around. So it's not the most modern, up-to-date system, this navigation, as you'll see in a minute, but it's still pretty cool to see in this car. When you consider what cars offered at the time, having a navigation system in your car in 2002 was pretty upper class and kind of out of this world. This was one of the first cars that featured a totally obscured rear wiper. As you can probably see on the video right now, it's not even here, but that's because it's hidden under this hollow piece right here at the top of the liftgate. Some luxury SUVs still don't implement something like this even to this day in this modern age of overly simplistic designs and things like that. Some people still just stick their wipers right there. They look ugly and unsightly, and it ruins the lines and the design of the car. The P38 had it hidden right here so that you wouldn't ever see it unless it was doing its job, and then once it was done, it retreats back to where it's not seen. P38 was pretty far ahead of its time when it came to this rear wiper design. This is, after all, the full-size Range Rover. Back then, there was no mention of a Range Rover Sport, a Range Rover Evoque, or even a long wheelbase version of the Range Rover. This was the Range Rover, the only one that existed. So as such, there wasn't that much room back here for tall passengers like myself. I'm 6'3", and this driver's seat is in my driving position. And it's not terrible, to be honest. My knees are touching the driver's seat in front of me, but only just barely. I do have plenty of footroom and just enough headroom. It's totally okay for people back here of most sizes for medium-sized journeys, but if you're stuck here for a long time, you can definitely get pretty stiff. I know that for a fact. But when you look around, it's still quite nice back here. After all, it is a Westminster Edition Range Rover, and with that, it comes with this glorious, lovely black gloss wood trim back here, which looks like wood in some areas where it's faded a little bit. It has a bit of a brown finish, but right now when it's in perfect shape like this panel is at the moment, it's just glossy black and looks great. In the center, there is a fold down center armrest with some cup holders that will pop out and reveal themselves when you press on this tab right here. They're not the greatest cup holders, but they work, they're passable. And in terms of comfort features, you really don't have that much at all. The middle passenger back here doesn't even get their own headrest to enjoy when you're crashed into. All you really have are electric windows and vents for air conditioning and climate back here. There's definitely a lot more when it comes to features and amenities up here. More than what you'd expect for a 1990s car, but only barely more than what you'd expect. Starting in the center, the prominent, most expensive and high-tech piece of technology that you have anywhere in this car is this gloriously dated navigation system. It has one trick up its sleeve, which is off-road navigation. You go into off-road navigation and you can set waypoints for when you're on off-road trails, and it'll give you things like a compass and your exact coordinates of your position, which is, even to this day, a really cool feature, and when you're on off-road trails, it's definitely a useful thing.
Forward guidance of route. Okay. Bearing 106. Arrived at waypoint. Guidance to waypoint. Bearing 009.
But you will most likely be using the P38 Range Rover on roads because that is where the tow truck can reach you as fast and as conveniently as possible. So for that, you have a road navigation page on the main menu, and you go into that, and it's exactly as you'd expect for on-road navigation in a car in the early 2000s it's pretty terrible, and using it takes a long time and is not very intuitive at all. So what I would suggest most of the time you do is just click the monitor off button, and it won't be bothersome or dating the interior as much. And then you're left to enjoy the rest of the interior in all of its 1990s luxury car glory. What you have here is an analog clock with the Land Rover logo placed right in the center, so you know who to blame when the clock inevitably breaks. But 212,000 miles in, this clock is still working. Moving up from that, you may look at this random up and down rocker switch right here and wonder what it's actually for. Well, that was for the air suspension setup that this car was originally equipped with back in 2002. But because, as you're not going to be surprised by, it was problematic back in the day, pretty much every single P38 Range Rover has been converted back to coil spring suspension, including this one. So you have this button that you can just play with as you drive along if you want. It's not going to do anything at all. And then moving back from that, you have a massive automatic gear selector to control the 4-speed automatic transmission, which also came with a low range gearbox setting. You would move the gear selector into neutral and then slap it over into low range mode, which had its own separate gate, including PRN 4, 2, uphill, downhill. 2 gates, one for high range, one for low range. I don't think I've ever seen that before. Most off-roaders of the day had a traditional automatic gear selector and a separate low range gearbox that was controlled by its own knob. This P38 Range Rover combined the two into one. And then the other thing is this mode button right here, which contains the only use of the word sport in the Land Rover brand in its entire history up to the year 2002. You had a sport mode for the transmission as well. If you wanted to unleash all 200 horsepower that the P38 had going for it, then you could press that button to get everything out of this car. And then you have the Range Rover hallmark of the armrests that are mounted to the seat. This is a long-standing Range Rover tradition, and it's here in the P38 with the screw that you would use to loosen the armrest so that you could adjust it and then tighten it again in any position that you like, as long as it's the very bottom. So the whole screw thing doesn't really make that much sense. But in this case, these armrests are actually useful because in the center you don't have a traditional armrest. Or do you? You look here and you have 4 cup holders, which for the front seat passengers in the late 1990s was pretty ahead of its time, and there's no center armrest to rest your arm on. But there is. You press this button right here, and then you can lift this up, and then it pivots, rotates around, and then it creates, as you lay it down upside down, a center console armrest that is stitched and covered in leather, which is really cool, and it's a really clever implementation of British engineering. But the problem with it is, as you're probably thinking right now, you have a choice in this car. You either get cup holders or an armrest here in the center. You don't get both. So I would suggest, since you already have these honestly more useful armrests mounted on the seats, just pressing the button again and rotating it so that you have cup holders, because they're more useful in this case. And then you remember that you're sitting on these lovely, glorious leather seats with basically no support around the outsides, but that doesn't matter because this is not something that you're taking on canyon roads regularly to have fun. It's something that's just supposed to be used every day and take off-road if you need to. And to that end, these seats are perfectly usable for that. They're very comfortable, very plush, and once again, 212,000 miles later, they're still in pretty good condition for what you'd expect. And then 2 more things before we look underneath the hood. Once again, I have to emphasize the quality and the luxury up here. It's not amazing, but it's definitely passable for a Range Rover back then. Everywhere you look, it's either soft touch plastic that is made to look like leather, or actual leather, or again, this beautiful glossy black wood trim. Everywhere you touch seems pretty okay. It's not as nice as a modern Range Rover is, obviously, but it's okay when you consider the time period that it was in. And then the last thing is the hilarious interior warning chimes that you have in the P38 Range Rover. Let's just turn the key. That's the warning that tells you that your key is in the ignition. So we turn it back to accessories mode, and then you have another one. This is one of my favorite things about the P38. These interior warning chimes are just the most ridiculous sounding things. It's funny because this is supposed to be a high-level, luxurious vehicle where you drive it around and you're just wafting about in pure silence until you turn the key and then all hell breaks loose. It's just beep, 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 beep. Just hilarious interior chimes. I will save your ears from having to deal with that anymore. Pull the key out and you notice it is an old-fashioned switchblade key, which is very nice for ADHD people like me who can just play with it and fidget with it all day long. It's a very nice thing, and it does have just two buttons, one for locking and one for unlocking. What you can find here is the Rover V8 and one of its very last iterations. The Rover V8 has a very long, illustrious history in things like Land Rovers and TVR sports cars. Pretty much every single upper level, high class, luxury or performance British car of the day in some iteration had a version of the Rover V8. And it was finally phased out in the year 2003 or 2004 with the end of the Discovery Series 2. And the very last iteration that you could find in a P38 Range Rover was the 4.6 liter version. This engine offered a whopping 218 horsepower, which when you consider Land Rovers of today with supercharged V8s and SVR versions, this was the most power you could get in 2002 out of a Range Rover. All you could get, at least in the United States, was a 4.6 liter Rover V8 with 200 horsepower. Early P38 cars had a 4 liter version of this engine. This is the more modern and up-to-date and more powerful 4.6 liter version of this engine. And when it comes to reliability, it's not that great, obviously. It's never great in any Range Rover, but I believe the Rover V8 was pretty simple and not too difficult to fix when things went wrong. The P38 Range Rover had most of its problems with its electrical systems, its computers and things like that would start to go haywire, and you'd get electrical gremlins, which are no stranger to this car. The temperature gauge doesn't sit in the right place, and the door locks just kind of have a mind of their own. The car will lock on its own because it's possessed. The Range Rover P38 was mostly known for electrical problems that would plague the ownership of this car, but underneath the hood, it wasn't super bad. It had its problems, but when you consider problems that other Range Rovers before and since have had, it wasn't too awful. So with that, let's take the P38 out on the road and see how it drives. Driving the P38 Range Rover. Now, once again, this car is owned by my dad, and he's had it for something like 13, 14 years now. So as you'd expect, I've had plenty of wheel time in this car. And I have to say, first time I drove it was when I was 16, and it was right when I was just starting to drive cars, so I didn't really have a great idea of what was good and what was bad. And as you would think with your first experience of an old school off-roader, you would probably hate it because the driving position isn't all that great. The steering column I can adjust somewhat, but not a whole lot. The steering is very vague, a little bit loose, not all that responsive. And not all that responsive is a perfect segue into talking about the 4.6 liter V8, which, yes, is the legendary Rover V8 and all of its heritage and glory. But when you consider what Range Rovers have been able to do ever since, it's way, way behind modern Range Rovers because it's only 200 horsepower in a car that weighs something like 5,000 pounds. So as you'd expect, when you put your foot down, it's not going to be very exciting. So let's see what we have here. That's all the way to the floor. $50. It is in fact quite slow. And the steering, like I said, isn't very great. The body control is atrocious. I mean, I move the steering wheel back and forth and the whole thing is just wobbling this way and that. You feel like you've become an actual bobblehead toy when you're sitting in this thing, especially when you go over bumps, because over bumps it is desperately uncomfortable, over bumps and uneven terrain. And that's because of its body on frame construction, because the downside of body on frame cars, especially when you're trying to make them luxurious, is that when you're going over uneven terrain, you're knocked back and forth to the point where you're gonna hit this window and give yourself a concussion. Of course, these are all things that you would expect from an old school SUV. Back then, the Range Rover was the only off-roader in its class that could tout itself as a luxury vehicle, and to that end, you have to forgive them for the fact that it has plenty of compromises when it comes to being on road, because at the time, the most important thing in a Range Rover was its ability to go anywhere, and that really shows through the way this car drives. Yeah, on roads, it's terrible. It's not a very nice experience, but that's only if you're trying to push it. When you're just driving along normally, it's perfectly quiet, it's very relaxed feeling, and it could be more comfortable over bumps, like I already said. But overall, for a 1990s car and a 1990s off-roader at that, they did a pretty good job at making this thing feel isolated and making it feel luxurious and easy to drive. You could drive this on a long journey, I know because I've done it, pretty easily without too much headache or aches anywhere else. It's a perfectly competent on-road car as long as you're not trying to race people, as long as you're not trying to feel it through turns, and as long as you're not judging it compared to modern Range Rovers and how they can handle being on-road. Off-road, however, this thing has all the equipment that you want. It has a proper low-range gearbox. It has proper four-wheel drive that the car handles on its own, which is pretty ahead of its time. And it's got tires with plenty of sidewall, because back then it didn't matter as much to have stupid 22-inch, 23-inch rims on a Range Rover, for God's sake. Back then, the Range Rover was something that people could actually genuinely take on off-road trails. I haven't seen anybody do that with a modern new Range Rover, because they've got these big wheels, they're very expensive, they're very hoity-toity, look at me on road and at the Starbucks drive-thru in their ethos. This P38 Range Rover was from a different time of the off-road SUV. Even the luxury 4x4 of the day was still not something you'd see in a Starbucks drive-thru, not something that you would see dropping kids off for soccer practice. It was something that you saw somebody driving, you thought, yeah, that dude knows how to live. He's probably on his way to his ranch and his 500 acres of land that he bought off of investing in oil. That's what you expect when you look at a P38 Range Rover. But now if you see a P38 Range Rover, it's a totally different story. You think that guy is a masochist and that guy knows how to handle pain. That guy is very patient. So with that, I want to thank everybody for watching, and I want to wish everybody a fantastic day. Like, subscribe, do all the normal YouTube stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.